Ancient urban defense. The engineering secrets behind Nehemiah's lightning-fast wall construction. Hey, imagine this. A city lying in rubble for nearly 140 years. Walls smashed by Babylonian armies back in 586 BC. Fates charred black. Stones scattered like broken teeth along the Kidron Valley. Neighbors circling like sharks. And then one guy shows up with royal papers from the Persian king and declares, "We're fixing this in 52 days. 52. Not months, not years, weeks. Contemporary engineers would have called it suicide. Historians still scratch their heads. How did a handful of traumatized returnees, priests, merchants, families who'd never laid a single stone pull off what looked physically impossible? That's the story of Nehemiah in 445 BC. And if you think ancient walls are just dusty history, wait until you see the brutal ingenuity they used. The shortcuts that saved weeks. The human operating system that turned fear into fuel. By the time we're done, you'll understand why this too. 400-year-old project still beats most modern crisis engineering hands down. Let's dive in, because the first surprise hits before they even picked up a tool. Nehemiah wasn't some general or architect. He was a cupbearer in the Persian court at Susa, basically the guy tasting the emperor's wine to make sure it wasn't poisoned. When he heard Jerusalem was still a ghost town, exposed and humiliated, he wept, fasted, then walked straight into Artaxerxes' eye and asked for leave. The king didn't just say yes. He gave timber from the royal forests, letters of safe passage, and appointed Nehemiah governor of tiny Yehud province. On paper, it was urban renewal. In reality, rebuilding fortifications in a Persian satrapy walked a razor's edge between loyalty and treason. One wrong move and the whole thing could be painted as rebellion. The geopolitical stakes were insane. Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, to the north, Tobiah the Ammonite to the east, Geshem the Arab to the south, they all smelled opportunity. A walled Jerusalem meant a strong Jewish identity right in their backyard. They started with mockery. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it by themselves? Will they finish in a day? Then came the death threats and sabotage plots. Nehemiah had to operate under constant surveillance. Every stone laid was watched, every delay celebrated by his enemies. And the ruin itself, over 1.5 miles of shattered perimeter on the eastern ridge of the city of David, plus the western stretches piles of rubble so deep in places that surveyors couldn't even walk the old line at night without climbing over debris. Contemporary estimates put the project at rebuilding or repairing something like 4,000 meters of defense in terrain that was already a nightmare. Suicide mission? Yeah, until Nehemiah turned psychology and logistics into weapons. Here's where the first genius move drops. Instead of centralizing labor like every big project in the ancient Near East, professional masons marching in from quarries, Nehemiah flipped the script completely. He used what we'd call a work where you live strategy. Chapter 3 of his memoir lists 41 separate teams, each assigned the stretch of wall right next to their own homes or businesses. Priests at the sheep gate, goldsmiths and perfumers down by the broad wall, merchants from Tekoa. Even Shallum's daughters hauled stones. No commuting, no wasted dawn marches across the city. Every family had skin in the game. Their own kids slept safer behind the stones they placed that day. This wasn't just efficient. It was a cellular structure. Think modern special forces teams or open source software development. If one sector hit a snag or faced intimidation, the whole project didn't grind to a halt. Momentum kept rolling in parallel. A breach in the northeast didn't collapse morale in the southwest. And because people defended their own turf, quality stayed high even under haste. Archaeologists digging Eilat Mazar's famous 30-meter section on the eastern ridge in 2007 found exactly this. Hasty but deliberate work. Stones unfinished, gaps stuffed with smaller rubble and mortar, but bonded well enough to stand for millennia. No single point of failure. That decentralized model is why the project never imploded despite 24/7 psychological warfare. But organization alone doesn't move mountains of stone. The real engineering hacks are what still make engineers today go, wait. They did what? Picture the scene. 140 years of collapsed walls mean the best foundation material is already lying everywhere. Broken blocks from the old Israelite defenses. Rubble from the Babylonian burn layer. Nehemiah's crews didn't quarry fresh limestone from distant hills. They reused the debris on site. Physics-wise, this was brilliant. Existing rubble provided immediate, stable footings on the steep eastern slope above the Kidron. No waiting for new cuts. No transport delays that could have added months. They built higher up the ridge in places where the old wall was too damaged, literally stacking on top of King David's earlier palace foundations the large stone structure Maze's team identified. The bonding technique. They used a mix of header stretcher patterns where they could stones laid lengthwise, stretchers alternating with stones turned end on headers to tie the wall faces to the core. But here's the time-saving killer. Massive filling with rubble core. Large facing stones on the outside, then the middle packed tight with smaller rocks and whatever mortar they could mix on the spot. No waiting days for curing like a modern concrete pour. Mud or quicklime mortar set enough overnight in the dry Judean air to hold the next course. The result? A wall at least 6.5 feet wide enough for 2 processions to march on top during the later dedication, stable enough to shrug off arrows and siege attempts for centuries. Compare that to today. Modern rapid response military engineering does the exact same thing with HESCO barriers or gabion walls. Local fill material, wire mesh or simple facing. Zero curing time. Disaster relief teams after earthquakes reuse rubble the same way. Nehemiah's crews invented the ancient version under spear point pressure. They turned trash into tactical advantage. Now, the tension ramps up even higher because speed meant vulnerability. The wall only reached half height when the death threats peaked. Sanballat and Tobiah were openly planning raids. So Nehemiah issued the order that defines this whole story. Every worker became a dual-purpose operator. One hand on the trowel or carrying basket, the other gripping a spear or sword at his side. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other, he wrote. Builders wore swords while laying stones. Trumpeters stood ready to sound alarms. Half the men stood guard while the other half worked. They never even took off their clothes except to wash, slept armed, ready. Ergonomically, that sounds impossible. How do you swing a hammer or position a 200-pound stone one-handed? The workflow adapted. Teams worked in tight shifts. Load carriers moved in protected groups. Builders kept weapons within arm's reach on the scaffolding. Watchtowers repaired or newly raised at key gates and high points served as both observation posts and signaling stations. Smoke or fire signals could flash warnings across the short perimeter faster than runners. The entire city became a living fortress in motion. Water logistics were just as critical. Jerusalem in late summer is brutal desert sun. No shade on the walls. The Gihon Spring and existing cisterns inside the city kept supply lines short. But crews still rotated hydration breaks every couple hours. No one collapsed from exhaustion, because the work where you live model meant people could grab quick meals and water from home between shifts. Tiny detail, massive impact on endurance. Then came the psychological turning point nobody saw coming. On the 25th day of a lull 52 days after they started, the wall stood complete. Gates hung, bolts in place, towers manned. The enemies heard about it and were very disheartened, for they perceived that this work had been done with the help of our God. The same guys who mocked feeble Jews now backed off. Morale inside the city flipped overnight. From refugee mindset scattered, ashamed, vulnerable to sovereign identity. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a defended people again. Archaeology backs every beat. Maze's Persian period tower and wall section, dated by pottery, arrowheads, and even 2 dot burials right under the foundations, shows the hasty signature, rough stones, rubble fill. No later Hellenistic layers mixed in. The wall wasn't pretty, but it was effective. Later sieges in the Hellenistic and Roman periods had to deal with these same defenses or their successors. It redefined urban defense in the Levant, proving that speed and local buying could beat superior resources. So what's the timeless takeaway? Extreme constraints don't kill innovation, they force it. When you have no time, no budget, no professional workforce, you strip everything to essentials. Reuse what's already there. Give every person ownership of their slice. Arm your builders with both tools and purpose. Nehemiah didn't wait for perfect conditions. He weaponized urgency. And the wall he raised in 52 days stood as proof that the best defense isn't always the strongest stones, it's the fastest, smartest, most committed human network behind them. If you're facing your own impossible deadline, whether it's a project at work, rebuilding after disaster, or just trying to protect what matters, remember this story. The rubble is raw material. The opposition is noise. And the clock, it's not your enemy. It's the spark. Drop a comment. What wall in your life needs rebuilding right now? And if this fired you up, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one, because history is full of these lightning fast comebacks when ordinary people decide the deadline doesn't get to win.